The cold was the first thing they noticed. It wasn't just winter cold. It was a deep, thin, biting cold that only exists on the top of the world. The 7 men, bundled in heavy gear, felt it seep through their layers as the massive MH-47 Chinook helicopter thundered through the black Afghan night. Below them was nothing but darkness, but their target was the peak of Takurgar, a mountain over 10,000 feet high. Their job was simple in theory. Get in quietly, set up a hidden spot to watch the valley below, and guide their friends during a big fight. But from the very start, the night felt wrong. The pilot's voice crackled in their headsets. They were coming in to land. The rear ramp of the helicopter began to lower, revealing a slice of the dark, snowy mountainside. The wind whipped through the cabin, a roaring mix of the rotor blades and the frigid air. The men got ready to move, standing up, checking their equipment one last time. They were focused, trained to perfection, but the conditions were brutal. The helicopter hovered, trying to find a stable spot on the uneven ground. One of the men, a tough and experienced leader, stood near the edge of the open ramp. He was getting ready to be the first one out. The helicopter shifted suddenly, a common thing in the unpredictable mountain winds. In a split second, his footing was gone. The heavy pack on his back shifted his weight. He didn't yell or cry out. One moment he was there, and the next he was swallowed by the darkness, falling from the helicopter onto the snow-covered peak below. A shock ran through the team. But before anyone could even process what had happened, the night exploded with light and sound. Orange flashes erupted from the darkness around the peak. The loud, quick thump-thump-thump of machine gun fire ripped through the air. Bullets slammed into the helicopter's metal skin with a sound like angry fists pounding on a door. They weren't alone. The enemy was waiting for them. They had flown straight into a trap. The pilot knew immediately the helicopter couldn't survive this. It was a big, slow target. An RPG, a rocket-propelled grenade, screamed past the open ramp. The decision was made in a heartbeat. To save the aircraft and everyone still on it, the pilot had to leave. He pulled up on the controls, the engine straining as the Chinook lurched away from the mountain. Inside, the remaining 6 men were thrown back. They were now looking out at the fading image of the mountaintop, where their friend was now alone, injured, and surrounded by the enemy. The feeling in the cabin was a thick mix of rage, helplessness, and cold dread. The damaged helicopter flew for only a few more minutes. It was riddled with holes, systems failing. The pilots fought the controls, but it was no use. They crash-landed roughly in the valley far below, the aircraft skidding to a stop in the dirt. Everyone was shaken but alive. The 6 men scrambled out, their minds already made up. There was no discussion, no vote. Their brother was on that mountain. They were going back for him. It was that simple. They quickly got on another helicopter, a fresh bird that came to rescue the crashed crew. They didn't take time to plan or wait for a bigger force. Every second counted. They told the new pilot to take them back to the peak, to the exact same spot. As the helicopter rose again into the night sky, the men sat in silence, checking their weapons, their faces set in hard lines. They knew what they were flying into. But knowing something and feeling it are two different things. The second approach was worse than the first. The enemy knew they would come back. As the helicopter's outline appeared against the night sky, every hidden gun on Takurgar opened up. It was like flying into a storm of metal. The noise was deafening, the roar of the engine, the chatter of machine guns, the explosions of RPGs. The pilot, showing incredible bravery, held the aircraft steady as long as he could. 30 seconds. He yelled over the radio. The ramp lowered again. This time, instead of quiet darkness, they were looking into the mouth of hell. Muzzle flashes lit up the rocks all around the landing zone. The men didn't hesitate. They charged out, one after another, into the knee-deep snow. The moment their boots hit the ground, the world dissolved into chaos. Bullets kicked up snow around their feet. The sound was overwhelming. They tried to move, to find their friend, to find cover, but the fire was coming from everywhere. They sprinted a short distance and threw themselves behind a small group of rocks. It wasn't a bunker. It was just a slight dip in the ground. They were completely exposed on the uphill side. An enemy machine gun nest, dug into the rocks higher up, had a perfect view of them. Every time someone moved, a burst of fire would force them back down. They were trapped, like fish in a barrel. The radio was buzzing with frantic calls. They were trying to tell the commanders far away what was happening. But the words were short, sharp, and urgent. One of the men, peering over a rock to try and spot the machine gun, saw another group of enemy fighters moving to flank them, to get behind their pathetic little cover. If that happened, it would be over. He yelled a warning to his team, but the sound was lost in the gunfire. He keyed his radio, his voice strained but clear, and said the words that would later define this moment for everyone who heard them. Asterisk, asterisk, we're F asterisk seeked. Asterisk, asterisk, it wasn't a scream of fear. It wasn't a surrender. It was a soldier's report. It was the only way to summarize the situation. Surrounded on a mountaintop, outnumbered, with a missing teammate, and no clear way out. It was the plain, ugly truth of their reality. The statement hung in the radio static for a second, a moment of raw honesty in the middle of the storm. Then the fight continued. They had to make it to sunrise. The words hung in the frozen air, a brutal truth they all felt in their bones. Asterisk, asterisk, we're F asterisk seeked. Asterisk, asterisk, but the moment the radio call ended, their training took over. The fear was there, a cold knot in the stomach, but it was pushed down by a clearer, more urgent need to survive the next 10 seconds. Then the next 10 after that. Their small scrap of cover, a shallow dip behind some rocks, was barely enough for them all. Snow packed into the necks of their jackets and soaked through their gloves. Every breath burned in the thin, high-altitude air. And above them, from 3 different directions, the enemy kept firing. The bullets didn't just whistle past. They cracked like a whip when they were close, and thudded into the dirt and snow around them with a sickening finality. The team leader, a man with a calm voice that somehow cut through the noise, started giving orders. They were short, direct words. You, watch the left. You, the right. We need to find that machine gun. They had to fight back, not just hide. One man, the Air Force combat controller who was their link to the sky, was already on the radio, his voice steady but urgent. He was calling to any aircraft that could hear him, trying to bring help from above. But it would take time. Right now, they were alone. And, through the chaos of noise, they heard a different sound. It was the distinct, heavy thump of a mortar being launched. A second later, a sharp whistle cut through the air, growing louder. Incoming! Someone yelled. They pressed themselves flatter into the ground, if that was even possible. The explosion erupted to their left, showering them with debris and snow. The enemy wasn't just trying to pin them down. They were trying to wipe them out. The mortar meant the enemy had them precisely marked. They were sitting ducks in that hole. The team leader knew they couldn't stay. To stay was to die. They had to move. The only direction was down the mountain, away from the peak. But to move meant crossing open ground, directly in the enemy's sight. It was an impossible choice, but it was the only one they had. We're moving downhill, he shouted. On my signal. Covering fire. They all knew what that meant. Some would have to stand up and shoot, to try and keep the enemy's heads down, while the others ran. It was a deadly gamble. The Air Force controller looked at the leader and nodded. He pointed up the hill toward one of the bunkers spitting fire at them. "I'll suppress that one," he said. It wasn't a question. Before anyone could argue, he took a deep breath, readied his weapon, and moved. He didn't run in a straight line. He scrambled, low and fast, from one bit of rock to another. His teammates opened up, firing as fast as they could at the enemy positions, trying to give him a chance. For a few seconds, it worked. The enemy fire lessened. The controller made it to a spot closer to the bunker. From there, he could see the opening where the machine gun fire was coming from. He began firing precise bursts into it. The enemy fire from that nest stuttered, then stopped. A heavy silence fell over that part of the mountain for just a heartbeat. The team leader saw the opening. "Go, go, go," he yelled. The men burst from their cover, sliding and running downhill through the deep snow. It was hard, clumsy movement, but they were moving. Back at the bunker, the controller saw movement inside. The enemy wasn't finished. They were repositioning. He knew if that gun started again, his friends would be cut down in the open. He made another decision. He charged forward, right at the bunker, firing as he went. It was an act of pure, selfless courage. He was drawing all the fire onto himself. From down the hill, the running men heard the furious exchange of gunfire behind them. Then it went quiet again. A different kind of quiet. They knew, in their hearts, what that silence meant. Their friend had given them a chance, but it had cost him everything. The loss hit them like a physical blow, even as they kept running. There was no time to grieve, only to honor his sacrifice by surviving. They crashed into another spot, a slightly better protected area near a large tree that had been shattered by shellfire. They were breathing in ragged, painful gasps. The cold air seared their lungs. Every one of them was wounded now. One man had a deep gash on his arm from shrapnel. Another was limping badly from a fall. Their faces were caked with a mixture of sweat, dirt, and powder snow. Their ammunition was getting low. They counted mags with numb fingers, speaking in short, clipped phrases. 2 left, 1.5. The enemy, encouraged, started to push down the mountain after them. They could hear voices shouting, getting closer. The light was beginning to change. The black sky was turning to a deep, dark blue. Dawn was coming. But instead of hope, it brought a new fear. In the light, they would be completely visible. There would be no more shadows to hide in. The team leader looked at his men. He saw the exhaustion, the pain, the determination. They had fought for hours in the freezing dark. They had lost friends. They were hurt, tired, and almost out of bullets. But they were not broken. He got back on the radio. His voice was hoarse, but clear. He didn't yell. He just stated the facts. They gave their position, their situation, their urgent need. He finished by saying, "We are in heavy contact. We cannot stay here. We need extraction, or we need a miracle." As he spoke, they could see the silhouettes of enemy fighters moving against the dawn skyline above them, getting into position for a final assault. The men checked their weapons one last time, making sure a round was in the chamber. They shared a look. No words were needed. They would fight until there was nothing left. They had made it this far. They would make the enemy pay for every single inch of that mountain. They settled in, waiting for the sun to rise, and for the next wave of the attack to begin. The deep blue of the Prydon sky was a liar. It promised light, but for the men on the mountainside, it only promised exposure. They could see their breath in thick clouds now, and they could see the shapes of the rocks around them. Soon, the enemy would be able to see them too. The team leader finished his radio call, the one asking for a miracle, and let the handset drop. The silence that followed wasn't quiet. It was filled with the sound of ragged breathing, the wind, and the distant, unsettling movements of the enemy regrouping above them. One of the younger members, his hands trembling slightly from the cold and the adrenaline, was methodically taping two of his magazines together. It was a trick for a faster reload. His movements were careful, precise. It gave his mind something to focus on, besides the creeping fear. The man next to him, the one with the wounded arm, had his eyes closed, just for a second, conserving every bit of energy he had left. This was the strange rhythm of war. Moments of sheer terror, followed by moments of exhausted stillness, waiting for the terror to begin again. High above them, so high they were just a faint speck in the growing light, a different kind of aircraft was circling. It wasn't a fast jet or a helicopter. It was a large, slow, four-engine propeller plane called an AC-130H Spectre. Its call sign was Grim 31. Inside, it was a world of humming electronics, green glowing screens, and focused tension. The crew had been listening to the desperate fight on the mountain for over an hour. They had heard the gunfire, the shouts, the terse radio calls, and the final, grim request for help dot in the back of the aircraft. It was cold and loud. The crew worked in dim red light to protect their night vision. One man, a combat controller from the Air Force, was glued to his radio. His job was to talk to the men on the ground. He had been trying to get a clear understanding of their exact position, but the radio transmissions were broken, cut with static and the sounds of battle. He spoke into his headset, his voice calm and steady, a direct contrast to the strained voices coming from the mountain. "All right, I need you to paint your location for me. Use your laser. Just for a flash. I know it's risky, but I need to see you." Down on the mountain, the team leader heard the request. Using the laser designator on his rifle would be like lighting a match in a dark room. It would show the plane exactly where they were, but it could also show the enemy. He looked at his men, then made the decision. He aimed his rifle out over the valley, away from the enemy positions, and clicked the laser on for a single, brief second dot in the belly of the AC-130. A sensor operator saw a tiny, brilliant dot of light appear on his black and white screen. It was like a single pixel of hope. "I got a spike. I have their position," he called out. Now they could see the men. The thermal cameras showed small, huddled shapes of white against the cooler gray of the rocks. They could also see the enemy positions, hotter, brighter spots dug into the higher ground. The picture was heartbreakingly clear. A handful of men, trapped and surrounded. The pilot of the massive plane, a man with a quiet voice, spoke over the intercom to his crew. "All right, we're the only show in town. We're going to work. Get ready." The plane began a wide banking turn, lining up for an attack run. The AC-130 was known as a gunship for a reason. It carried a terrifying array of weapons that could fire with pinpoint accuracy from the sky, a rapid-firing cannon, a heavier 40mm gun, and a massive 105mm howitzer. Like the kind usually pulled by trucks on the ground, the combat controller on the plane spoke to the men below. "Gunship is on station. We are ready to engage. I need you to talk me on to the target. What is closest to you?" The team leader, pressed against the rocks, peered uphill. He could see muzzle flashes from a bunker about 100 meters away. "The most dangerous one is directly north of our position. A bunker in the rocks. They have a machine gun and at least 3 fighters. Copy. Stand by." Inside the plane, the fire control officer input the coordinates. The huge plane was now flying in a slow, steady circle around the mountain, like a shark orbiting its prey. The side of the aircraft facing the mountain had a series of protruding barrels. One of them, the 40mm, began to move with a low electric whir. pointing downward. "Gun ready," the officer said. "Cleared hot," the pilot responded. What happened next was a sound the men on the mountain would never forget. From the sky came a series of deep, resonating thump-thump sounds, like the beating of a giant's heart. Then, a split second later, the world above them erupted. Massive explosions, one after another, walked directly up the hill and into the enemy bunker. Dirt, rock, and debris shot into the air. The concussions from the blasts shook the ground the team was lying on. They pressed their faces into the dirt, not from fear of the enemy, but from the sheer, awesome power of the fire coming from their own sky. For a few beautiful minutes, the enemy fire stopped completely. The gunship had silenced the most immediate threat. A wave of relief, so strong it felt like a physical thing, washed over the men. They allowed themselves to believe, for just a moment, that they might make it, but the enemy was adaptable. They realized the plane could only shoot at what it could see from its circling path. They began to move closer to the trapped team, using the steep terrain and the very closeness of the Americans as a shield. They knew the plane couldn't risk dropping a huge shell too close to its own men. The team leader heard movement to his right, far too close. He spun and fired 2 rounds. A cry echoed back. The enemy was within hand grenade range now. The gunship was saving them from the big threats, but it couldn't stop a single man crawling through the rocks back in the plane. The crew watched this happen on their screens. They saw the hot signatures of the enemy creeping closer and closer to the cold, huddled signatures of the team. The frustration was immense. They had all this firepower, and they were helpless to use it at the most critical distance. It was then that one of the men in the back, a seasoned special operations sniper who had been watching the screen silently, spoke up. He was looking at a specific part of the mountain where one enemy fighter, brave or foolish, had moved to a more exposed spot to get a better angle. This fighter was now in a clear position, aiming directly down at the team. The sniper turned to the combat controller. "I have a solution on that one," he said, his voice quiet. "But I need a stable window. Can we get a tighter turn?" He wasn't talking about the plane's big guns. He was talking about his own weapon. A long, heavy .50 caliber rifle, bolted to the floor near a small porthole window. He was suggesting something almost unheard of, a sniper shot from a moving plane over a mile in the sky at a target on a mountain. It was a 1 in a million chance. But it was the only chance they had to hit an enemy at close to their friends. The pilot didn't hesitate. "Setting up for a shot window," he said. The big plane tilted into a steeper bank. The sniper got down behind his rifle, his eye pressed against the scope, looking down at a world of swirling snow and tiny ant-like figures. The inside of the plane was a world of steady noise and focused tension. The big aircraft banked into a tighter turn, the engines droning a constant note. The sniper, lying prone behind his rifle, was in a bubble of total concentration. Everything else faded away, the hum of the electronics, the voices of the crew over the intercom, even the steady thump-thump-thump of the plane's own big guns firing at targets further away. His entire universe was the view through his scope and the feel of the cold rifle stock against his cheek. The rifle itself was a monster. A bolt-action .50 caliber, it was usually fired from a solid, unmoving position on the ground. It wasn't made for this. It was bolted to a special platform on the aircraft's floor, but the plane was alive around it, vibrating, shifting, moving through the air currents. Through the scope, the mountain wasn't a still picture. It was a living, swaying thing. The crosshairs drifted over rocks and snow, never settling. The target, a tiny dark figure against the white snow, was over a mile away and moving. He wasn't just moving. He was bobbing and weaving, firing his weapon down the hill. And the plane was moving in a circle. So the sniper had to calculate everything at once: the speed of the plane, the angle of the bank, the wind rushing past the small porthole, the distance, and the movement of the man below. It was like trying to thread a needle from the back of a galloping horse. Next to him, his spotter was glued to a separate high-powered sight. The spotter's job was to watch, to calculate, and to talk the sniper onto the target. He was the sniper's second set of eyes and his calm, guiding voice. "Wind is steady from the west. About 20 knots at this altitude," the spotter said, his voice low and even. "He's pacing. He stops to fire for a 3-second burst, then moves 2 steps to his right. The pattern is consistent." The sniper listened, making tiny, instinctive adjustments with his body. He wasn't just aiming the rifle. He was trying to become a part of it, to feel the rhythm of the plane's movement and match it. He slowed his breathing. In, out, long, steady breaths. He needed his heart rate to drop. Between heartbeats, the body is still. That's when you take the shot. He waited for the perfect moment in the plane's turn. The pilot was flying a precise circle, and there was a single point in that circle where the plane's wing would be level for just a few seconds, offering the most stable platform. They were coming up on it now. "Stand by for shot window." The pilot's voice came over the sniper's headset. 10 seconds. The spotter watched the target below. He's stopped. He's aiming. He's stable. The enemy fighter had found a spot he liked, a small rocky outcrop. He was leaning into it, preparing to fire another long burst down onto the trapped team. For a moment, he was perfectly still dot in the scope. The crosshairs swam over the figure. The sniper's finger rested lightly on the trigger. He wasn't fighting the movement of the plane anymore. He was starting to move with it, like a sailor feeling the rhythm of the sea. The crosshairs drifted past the target, then back. He began to apply pressure, a smooth, steady squeeze. 5 seconds, the pilot said. Steady. The spotter whispered. His eye pressed to his lens. Down on the mountain, the team knew none of this. All they knew was the immediate, close danger. They could hear the enemy fighter above them, the distinct sound of his weapon. Dirt and rock chips sprayed over them from his bullets, hitting the ground just feet away. One of the men, the one with the wounded leg, tried to shift position and cried out in pain, drawing another burst of fire. They were pinned utterly and completely. They fired back where they could, but it was blind, desperate shooting. They were out of options. The gunship's big shells couldn't help them here. This fight was now just a few dozen meters wide dot in the plain. The pilot's voice was calm. 3, 2, 1, shoot. At that exact moment, the crosshairs drifted over the center of the dark figure in the scope. The sniper didn't jerk the trigger. He simply finished the squeeze he had already begun. The sound inside the aircraft was staggering. A deafening, crushing boom that shook the entire frame. A huge tongue of flame erupted from the muzzle brake, lighting up the dark interior of the cabin for an instant. The spent shell casing, the size of a small soda can, flew out and clanged loudly on the metal floor. The rifle had spoken. Then silence. Not true silence, but a sudden, tense void filled only with the drone of the engines. The sniper, his shoulder aching from the tremendous recoil, stayed perfectly still, his eye not leaving the scope. He watched. The spotter watched, holding his breath. For a long, agonizing second, nothing seemed different. The world below kept turning. Then the spotter let out a sharp breath. Impact. Through the scope, the sniper saw it. The dark figure was no longer standing. It was down, collapsed behind the rocky outcrop. There was no movement. Target is down, the spotter confirmed, his voice now rising with a mix of awe and relief. Direct hit. I repeat, direct hit. The shooter is down. The words were relayed over the radio, but down on the mountain, the team didn't need to hear them. They felt the change instantly. The relentless close gunfire that had been hammering their position just stopped. The sudden quiet was almost louder than the noise had been. The only sounds were the wind and the distant, deeper thumps of the gunship engaging other targets further away. The team leader dared to raise his head a few inches higher. He scanned the rocks above. No muzzle flash. No movement. He looked at the man next to him, whose face was a mask of confusion and hope. Did he run? The man whispered dot before the leader could answer. The voice of the combat controller in the plane crackled over their radio. Confirm your immediate threat is neutralized. The shooter on the ridgeline has been eliminated. You have a window. It took a second for the words to sink in. Eliminated. Not scared away. Not suppressed. Hit. From the sky. They didn't understand how. It seemed impossible. But the evidence was the silence pressing in on them. The most immediate, terrifying pressure had been released dot. It didn't mean they were safe. They were still surrounded, still wounded, still on a hostile mountain. But for the first time in hours, they could take a full breath without expecting a bullet to find them in that exact moment. They had been given a gift. A few precious minutes of respite. A chance to regroup, to bind a wound tighter, to share a sip of water, to plan their next move. The enemy was still out there, and the fight was far from over. But a single nearly impossible shot from a rifle in the sky had just turned the tide. It had bought them time. And on that mountain, with the sun finally beginning to show its edge on the horizon, time was the most precious thing they had. The silence that followed the sniper's shot was fragile, like thin ice. It wasn't peace. It was a temporary pause. The men on the mountain felt it. They used it not to relax, but to scramble. The team leader immediately started moving them again, further down the slope to a slightly better cluster of boulders. Every movement was painful and slow. They dragged their wounded, their boots sliding in the loose shale and snow. But they were moving with purpose now. The shot from the sky had broken the enemy's closest fist, and they had to capitalize on it. High above, the crew of the AC-130 was not celebrating. They were working harder than ever. The sniper had dealt with one immediate problem, but the bigger picture on their screens still looked dire. The hot signatures of enemy fighters were now spreading out, trying to flank the team from multiple sides. The combat controller's voice became a steady stream of calm, clear instructions to the men below. Okay, listen up. You have movement about 100 meters to your east, behind a low stone wall. They are grouping. I need you to keep your heads down for the next 60 seconds. We are going to work. The big gunship banked again, its side-mounted cannons pivoting with a low whine. The deep, rhythmic thump-thump of the 40-millimeter cannon started up once more. This time, the explosions walked along the distant stone wall, sending plumes of dirt and rock into the air. The plane became their guardian, a circling protector using its terrifying strength to hold the enemy at a distance. It couldn't clear the mountain, but it could create a wall of fire that the enemy was reluctant to cross. Down below, the team could only listen and trust. They huddled in their new spot, feeling the concussions of the blasts through the ground. They were spectators to their own rescue, putting their faith in the voices from the clouds. The Air Force controller with them, his arm now wrapped in a rough bandage, stayed on the radio, giving the gunship small corrections. That last burst was perfect. Shift fire 50 meters north. They're trying to move around that way. As the morning light finally grew strong, it revealed the full severity of their situation. Their faces were gaunt, etched with exhaustion and streaked with grime. Their gear was torn. Their eyes held the flat, focused look of men pushed far beyond their limits. But the light also meant other things could see them. Soon, the distant roar of jet engines echoed through the valley. Fighter planes, called in by the relentless combat controller in the AC-130, began to streak overhead. They dropped larger bombs on the enemy positions higher up the mountain, massive booms that shook the entire peak. The battle was escalating. They were no longer a small, lost team. They were the centerpiece of a massive air war. But the enemy was not giving up. They knew who they had cornered. The fight became a brutal tug-of-war. The planes and the gunship would pound an area, and for a few minutes it would go quiet. Then, a few brave or fanatical fighters would push forward through the rubble, getting dangerously close again, and the small team would have to fight them off with their dwindling ammunition. It was a draining cycle. Hope would rise with the sound of a bomb, then fall again with the crack of a nearby rifle shot. Hours passed this way. The sun climbed, doing little to warm the frozen ground. The men were suffering from dehydration, hypothermia, and the crushing weight of fatigue. They had been fighting for their lives for over half a day. They were running on fumes and sheer will. Then, a new sound cut through the din. A sound they had been praying for. The distinct, heavy thump-thump of helicopter rotor blades. But this time, many of them. And it wasn't coming from just one direction. The cavalry was finally arriving. A quick reaction force of Army Rangers, knowing the cost, had been fighting their own brutal battle to get to the peak and reach the stranded men. They had faced ambushes and heavy fire themselves. The team leader got the radio call. Hold your position. Friendlies are coming to you from the south. Mark your location. With the last of their colored smoke grenades, they threw a plume of green smoke into the still air. It drifted up, a desperate signal. The weight was agonizing. They could hear intense gunfire now, not aimed at them, but close. The Rangers were clearing a path. It was some of the sweetest music they had ever heard. Finally, through the rocks and smoke, figures appeared. Not in the flowing robes of the enemy, but in the familiar camouflage of American soldiers. The Rangers moved with a sharp, professional aggression, securing the area around the battered SEALs. A Ranger medic slid to a stop next to the most badly wounded man, immediately beginning work. No dramatic speeches were made. There were just nods, claps on the shoulder, and the immediate transfer of responsibility. The trapped men's fight was over. The Rangers' fight to get them out was now in its final stage. The extraction was not clean or easy. The enemy, seeing their prize slipping away, threw everything they had at the helicopters that came in. The birds took fire as they landed, but the door gunners and the circling aircraft above poured down covering fire. One by one, the exhausted men were half carried, half dragged onto the waiting helicopters. They collapsed onto the metal floors, surrounded by the Rangers who had come for them. As the helicopter lifted off, banking away from the scarred and smoking mountain, one of the SEALs looked out the open door. He could see the whole battlefield, the cratered slopes, the burning wreckage of earlier fights. He saw the tiny patch of rocks where they had been pinned, where they had believed they would die. It looked so small from up here. He looked at the AC-130, still circling patiently high above, a silent sentinel that had never left them. He turned his head and looked inside the cabin. He saw his teammates, alive, breathing, their eyes closed in utter exhaustion, or staring blankly at the ceiling. He saw the body of their fallen friend, finally being taken home. The cost was written on all of them, in blood and in spirit. The helicopter flew towards the safety of the base, the noise of the blades drowning out all thought. There was no cheering, no celebration. There was only the profound, hollowed-out quiet of survival. They had been saved by a chain of heroism, the courage of the teammate who charged the bunker, the incredible skill of a sniper in a plane a mile high, the relentless will of the gunship crew, and the brave, costly assault by the Rangers. It was a long walkout, made on the shoulders of others. They had started the night as a small team on a silent mission. They were coming back as something else, survivors bound forever to a mountain, and to the brothers, both present and lost, who had refused to leave them behind.